properly. Yeah.
Torah for its own sake, the parting of ways between Chassidim and Misnagdim, the opponents of Chassidim. So now, Bruce, I actually sent you a moment ago email because people were given the text last time. It was 2 weeks ago, so it could be they don't even remember anymore the text. So maybe I don't know if you're able to quickly send it out again as we're talking.
Yeah, Arthur probably does it faster than me. Can you
It's
find that, Arthur?
the same text as
Put that in the
last week.
chat.
Same text as last week, right? Okay.
Okay.
So we're going to do a little review of what we did because we didn't meet for 2 weeks, and then we're going to go on. Now, I'd like to express, first of all, my appreciation to Danny Chesterman because he sent me a really nice link to a lecture it was actually a sort of an interview, which was with a person who's considered to be in the academic world one of the foremost experts in this whole period of Jewish history, and that is someone named Professor Immanuel Etkes. His name is he's an older man at this point, and has written many books on the Baal Shem Tov, on Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi, on the Vilna Gaon, this whole fascinating period in Jewish history, Immanuel Etkes. Now, the topic at hand is to try to get an insight into what is considered widely to be one of the parting of the ways between Chassidim and Mitnagdim. From our perspective, and from the perspective of the Holy New York Times, so those two sectors of the Haredi world are both called ultra-Orthodox, right? What's the difference? It's very hard to appreciate the heat and even physical violence that was involved in the disputes between the Chassidim and Mitnagdim. And when we take a look at one of the particular issues, which is considered to be a kind of lightning rod or a focus of the dispute, even that, it's hard to imagine that people got so excited and upset about this particular issue, which is how you define Torah for its own sake, Torah Lishma. But in light of the talk with Immanuel Etkes, this professor who's an expert in that, and I went ahead and listened to some other lectures of his, I think it helped me to find a way to explain this in a better way. But I'm going to save that for a few minutes. Let's just go ahead and do the little review on the specific issue, and then I'm going to try to explain why it became such a focus of, like I said, even physical violence. Now, the issue is when the Mishnah says, Kol osek b'Torah Lishma, anybody who is involved in the study of Torah for its own sake, Zocheh l'dvarim harbeh, merits many things. Well, that sounds very attractive, but what is that condition of Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake? What does it mean to learn Torah for its own sake? So there are actually people that claimed that it means that when you learn Torah in a way in which it's purely for the sake of God, so much so that you have to learn Torah in a way in which you get no personal pleasure from it. There was such a school of thought that you can't enjoy it, because if you enjoy it, then you're learning for your sake, not for heaven's sake. So we saw last time that one of the great Chassidic rabbis, it happens to be, even though he's considered to be one of the greatest halachic experts on the laws of Shabbat, especially the Sachachava Rebbe, who wrote a book on the laws of Shabbat, Eglei Tal, and his introduction there, he goes to war against this idea that if you enjoy your Torah learning, that somehow it's taking away from the notion of learning Torah for its own sake. And he explains that, on the contrary, that God wants Torah to be a source of joy, and one should learn Torah in a way in which you get satisfaction from it and joy, and you try to learn in a creative fashion. And this in no way detracts from the notion of Torah Lishma, learning Torah for its own sake. But he doesn't then go on to explain what learning Torah for its own sake means. For that, we saw the analysis of one of the greatest Chassidic Rebbes of all time, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Lodi, the founder of Chabad Chassidut. And he gives a very profound analysis of what happens when we learn Torah, that given the fact that when you learn something, you're internalizing the information into your mind and you become literally one with that information. It's literally internalized into the brain. Right? What if what you're learning is not just French literature or physics, but it is the will and wisdom of God? Well, the will and wisdom of God is God. That's a little hard leap to take to understand that idea, the will and wisdom of God. The Torah is God. But if you think about it, when we call God a perfect unity, it means, among other things, that you cannot distinguish between God and his ideas, right? God and his intellect, God is will and wisdom. So if we internalize God's will and wisdom into our mind, we've internalized God into our mind. So we're in a state of mystical unity with God, excuse me, when we internalize God's will and wisdom by learning Torah. And then the Baal HaTanya says, that's what it means to learn Torah, hang on a second, for its own sake. That we're learning Torah in order to create this unity with God, this mystical unity of God, by internalizing literally into our minds God's will and wisdom, which is God. So we could call that, by using a term very commonly used in Chassidut, dveikut, that state of mystical communion, mystical union, probably better, with God, that is Torah Lishma. And that's how he defines it. Torah Lishma is, I'm learning Torah in order to create that mystical unity with God. Yes, Bruce.
Does anyone take the approach where rather than trying to look at this from the positive side, which is either mystical or very deep and hard to define, how about the negative side, where it's not if your father makes you do it, or you're doing it for a lot of money or any money, or peer pressure, meaning those are all reasons you do things, certainly not for their own sake. And then by elimination, what's simply left is for your own sake, whatever that might mean.
Yeah, for its sake. Right. So
yeah, I mean,
that's interesting. I mean, I understand what you're saying. The problem with it, it kind of leaves me empty, and I'll tell you why. Because we actually saw that in the Eglei Tal. The Eglei Tal said, don't think that learning in a way which gives you pleasure somehow is going to undermine the definition of learning Torah for its own sake. But he doesn't go ahead and explain it. So what does that, affirmatively mean to learn Torah for its own sake? So you're suggesting something that I think suffers from the same deficiency. That is, if you learn Torah for money, if you learn Torah because your parents made you to learn, if you learn a Torah so that you could get the title rabbi, etc., that would undermine Torah for its own sake. So, but then what does Torah for its sake mean? So you're saying anything other than those things. So
right.
I think you can appreciate that.
A lot. I mean, everyone has a different interpretation of what it might be, but they're all good.
Okay, so I would say the following.
And they're not for the other reason.
Yeah, I would say the following. I'll tell you why I don't like what you're saying, though I understand the logic of it. Because the Mishnah said, anybody who learns Torah for its own sake merits many things. So if what you're saying is true, that there is no specific definition of Torah for its own sake, it's really to exclude learning Torah for ulterior motives, like money, like honor, like fear of your parents, or whatever it may be, then I would have expected the Mishnah to say, anybody who learns Torah free of ulterior motives merits many things, right? Because that would be the focus. Make sure you don't have ulterior motives. But that's not the Mishnah's formulation. The Mishnah's formulation is in the positive, right? Someone who learns Torah for its own sake, whatever that may mean, right, merits many things, right? If it was to exclude the negative, the ulterior motives, then I would have expected that to be the formulation. So I understand your point.
chasuna. And there's no phrase there, chasra chasuna, like oftentimes,
Yeah, Chitsuri
oftentimes the
Mechsera.
Gemara will say, well, there's
Right.
some missing
Yeah.
words here.
Yeah, Chitsuri Mechsera. Right. No, that's it doesn't say that. Okay. So okay, fine. So we're still a little bit so that's why we have this the Balatanya who's saying, oh, it does mean something affirmative. It means for the sake of mystical union with God. And we also saw the Balatanya goes on so far as to say that when you're learning Torah for many hours consecutively, like in the Efrat Kollel, that you should actually periodically take a break in order to kind of recalibrate your learning Torah for its own sake, right? Because you may get so engrossed in learning Torah and having so much fun that you may forget why you're learning it. So every hour, take a break, and for 3 minutes, contemplate this notion of by learning Torah, I'm experiencing mystical unity with God by internalizing God's will and wisdom, which is God himself. So that's a pretty remarkable focus and emphasis on this notion that the learning of Torah is for the sake of this mystical unity with God, so much so that you should even take a few breaks in the course of the day of learning Torah in order to reestablish that intent. Okay, so that was an example of the Chassidic approach towards Torah Lishma, learning Torah for its own sake. It's in order to create this mystical union with God. Then we contrasted, began the contrast with the approach to the Vilna Gaon. Now, the most famous articulation of the approach to the Vilna Gaon in this particular issue is in the book of the chief disciple of the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. That book is called Nefesh HaChaim. By the way, it's on Sifriya in that website. The whole thing there. It's a highly recommended sefer. As a matter of fact, I would learn Tanya and Nefesh HaChaim. That would be a really good study. First learn Tanya and then Nefesh HaChaim. That's what I would suggest, and you'll discover some really interesting things and important insights into both Chassidic spirituality on the one hand and Litvisha, Misnagdic spirituality. Is there such a thing? There certainly is. And the Nefesh HaChaim, that sefer, is the access to understanding what it means to have a Litvisha spirituality. So in Nefesh HaChaim, he starts out by saying, don't think that Torah Lishma means mystical communion with God. Doesn't mean that. And he goes on to give several proofs of how that can't be. He points out that we have a midrash that says that King David asked God to consider saying Tehillim as the equivalent of learning Gemara. That midrash clearly indicates that learning Gemara is on a higher level than saying Tehillim, because we're asking God to be liberal and to be generous and to consider that even the study and recitation of Tehillim should be considered as if it were on the high level of learning Gemara. Furthermore, in addition to the fact that we see learning Gemara is on a higher level, more importantly, if in fact communion with God is the goal of learning Torah, and it is the definition of learning Torah for its own sake, what could be more spiritual than Tehillim? Learning Tehillim is an overt spiritual experience. That's the content. The content is our relationship with God. So if in fact Torah Lishma meant I'm learning Torah in order to experience mystical communion with God, I'm better off learning Tehillim all day long than learning Gemara. But that's clearly not true, as we see that midrash that King David said, please God, consider saying Tehillim as if it were like learning Gemara. Fine. He also points out, as we saw last time, that if you think that the purpose of learning Torah is to experience mystical communion with God, you'll never be able to learn Gemara properly. Why not? Because it happens to be learning Gemara is hard. It takes very clear thinking and logical analysis. If you're swooning, I'm going to sound a little sarcastic or cynical here, but I don't mean to be. But if you're swooning with spirituality, feeling this mystical, ecstatic experience of communion with God, there's very little chance that you'll be able to clearly understand the Gemara. Because Gemara requires very clear analytical thinking. You have to be extremely sober to learn Gemara properly. But if you're in a state of spiritual ecstasy, that is going to detract from the rational sobriety necessary to learn Gemara properly. So, therefore, the Nefesh Chaim says, learning Torah for its own sake cannot possibly mean to have the state of spiritual ecstasy being in mystical unity with God. But then the question is, okay, now I know what it isn't, like Bruce's approach. What it isn't. But what is it? What is it in a positive sense? So he goes on to quote the Rosh. He said learning Torah Lishma means that I'm learning Torah, and this is so simple, it may be even shocking. Learning Torah for its own sake means I'm learning Torah in order to understand it. I'm learning Torah lahavin, to understand it. And important, the Rosh goes on, ulosif lekachu pilpul, and to increase understanding, to come up with novel insights. That's what Torah Lishma means. It means to learn Torah in order to understand and develop greater clarity and insight into Torah. Wow. That's it. That's it. Right? That does not sound particularly mystical, and it is not. It also, for linguistic reasons, which we'll point out in a minute, fits in very well with the grammar of the term Torah Lishma. And I'll explain that in just a moment. Okay. Now, the Nefesh Chaim goes on to point out that don't think that the study of Torah is a purely intellectual experience that does not require some spiritual preparation. No, it's a mitzvah, and it's a mitzvah on the highest possible level, and therefore it requires a state of fear of God, an understanding of what you're doing is a spiritual experience, though rational and sober, on the highest possible level. So I just want to show you how he says that briefly. So it's in source number 6. We'll just read the English there real quickly. I hope you have the source in front of you, and then if you don't, you can just listen. So he does say the following, I quote, "However, it is certain that it's impossible to say that the matter of involvement with Torah does not require any purity of thought and fear and awe of God, heaven forbid. For after all, we learned an entire Mishnah, if there's no fear, there's no wisdom." So he's just pointing out, we're not talking about Harvard here or Cambridge, right? We're not talking about a cerebral experience and nothing else. It is a cerebral experience, but it's a cerebral experience which is in the context and framework of fear of heaven. And that's a necessary prerequisite to learn Torah properly. Okay, so I don't want to make the Vilna Gaon into a Harvard professor here. Okay. Now, I want to address the issue that Professor Etkes helped me to understand better. This may seem very technical. How do you define the term Torah Lishma? It's a little hard to understand, like I mentioned before, why this became such a bone of contention between the Chassidim and their opponents, so much so that the Vilna Gaon pronounced a cherem, a ban on the Chassidim. You couldn't intermarry with them. You couldn't eat of their shechita, their ritual slaughter, their meat. There were physical altercations. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Ladi was put in jail because of the incitement against him of the opponents by the students of the Vilna Gaon. Why such a big deal? So Professor Etkes suggests the following, and this sounds true to me. If one suggests that Torah Lishma, learn Torah for its own sake, means to learn Torah in order to create a state of mystical union with God, what we're doing is we're saying that the height of service of God is the spiritual experience. The spiritual experience. Now, I just want you to think about the implications of that notion. The Vilna Gaon, and perhaps authentically representing normative traditional Judaism, is positing that the bottom line of traditional Judaism is avodat Hashem, serving God. How does one serve God? Through harmonizing one's behavior with the Torah, by performing the mitzvot, by refraining from transgressing. That's what it means to serve God. If one supplants that with a demand on spiritual experience, that can, and sometimes did, undermine the very basis of normative Judaism. Because if what I'm looking for is the ecstatic, euphoric experience of union with God, then if I can find that in non-normative behaviors, that opens the floodgates to deviance from normative halacha. All of the movements that we witnessed, Shabtai Tzvi, Jacob Frank especially, these false messianic movements, in which apparently, in the case of Jacob Frank, there were actually orgies that took place under the ostensive framework of worship of God. Well, if one feels that is an ecstatic, euphoric experience is somehow the essence of Jewish spirituality, then why not? We even see this in contemporary times, and I hope I don't offend too many people with this next comment, that neo-Chassidism or New Age Judaism, these are things that have become quite popular in certain circles, where Chassidic texts are studied, Kabbalistic texts are studied, but the whole notion of obligation to performance of mitzvot is removed. And what's left is the emphasis on the spiritual experience and the use of Kabbalistic texts, Chassidic texts, with the goal of experiencing some type of joy, some type of spiritual elevation. I have nothing personally against joy or spiritual elevation, but if that becomes the driving force and motive, it can and does lead to, in the case of New Age, Neo-Hasidism, of a kind of distortion of profound degree, in which spiritual experience has substituted for observance of the mitzvot. Now, the Vilna Gaon didn't have to be a prophet to see New Age Judaism or Neo-Hasidism, because he saw it in his own time, or at least it was reported to him. If we go back to the beginnings of the Chassidic movement, there were Chassidic rabbis, Rabbi Aaron of Karlin, and other Chassidic groups, in which a davening took place in a spirit of revelry, and where people in the middle of davening would do somersaults. We have firsthand testimony from that time of, in the middle of davening, people doing somersaults in shul and screaming, jumping up and down. Now, you may say, well, what's so terrible about that? So, at least you're combining spiritual exercise and physical exercise. But I think you can appreciate that when that becomes the nature of davening, then how about halachic structures like zmanei tefillah, times for davening? Famously, an opponent of the Chassidic movement once asked the Kutzker Rebbe, how in Kutsk was a town, how in Kutsk they could ignore the times set down in the Talmud, in the Shulchan Aruch, for saying the Shema, for davening the Amidah, etc. How could those times be ignored? And especially the early Hasidic groups, famously did ignore the times for davening, and even today, I'll discuss that in a second. How could in Kutsk they ignore these times? Aren't they Orthodox Jews? So the Kutzker Rebbe answered, in Kutsk, we don't have any clocks, only neshamas, only souls. So that's a wonderful story. I wonder if the Kutzker Rebbe actually said it, but it's a great story because it demonstrates what Professor Etkeson, thank you, Danny, I see you there, that point that he was trying to make. And that is that though may one regard the notion of how you define Torah Lishma as a technical issue, and why such a big fuss made of that, because it's emblematic of the substitution of spiritual experience for the halachic framework of adherence to very specific and disciplined, orderly life, with all that could lead to. Now, I'd like to examine one of the most interesting crossover personalities in this Misnagdic Chassidic spectrum, and that is the approach of Rav Kook. Rav Kook, as I like to point out, is particularly interesting when one is examining this issue of the Chassidic view versus the view of the Vilna Gaon, because he's a product of two worlds in many ways. He learned in Volozhin, the yeshiva of Rav Chaim of Volozhin, the chief disciple of Vilna Gaon. His father learned in Volozhin. So he's coming out of the aristocratic royalty of the Mitnadic world. But as I've mentioned many times, his mother came from a Chabad background. Chabad. It was an intermarriage. It always troubled me. How did that shit happen? I don't think they met at a singles event at Temple Beth Zion. How did his parents meet each other? So I happened to discover just recently an article where someone tried to analyze a chapter of Rav Kook's history that's not so well known, and that is his youth and where he came from. And I discovered something interesting. It was a discovery for me. And that is that Rav Kook's mother did come from a Chabad background. Her father was a Chabad Chassid. But guess where her father, this Chabad Chassid, had learned? In Volozhin. Rav Kook's mother was the daughter of a Chabad Chassid who had defected from the Beit Midrash of Volozhin of the Vilna Gaon. We have to appreciate that that's what was going on at that time, that there were great Talmidei Chachamim who were in the circle of Vilna Gaon, who were slowly, one by one, defecting from the approach of the Vilna Gaon and becoming traders, right? And becoming associated with the various Hasidic movements. So even though Rav Kook's mother was from Chabad, you can see how it was Chabad, yes, but right out of Volozhin as well. So Rav Kook is very much coming out of the tradition of the Vilna Gaon, and even his Chassidic side is, maybe depending upon what perspective you're coming from, is tainted by the approach. It's Chabad tainted by Volozhin. Okay, that's the interesting background of Rav Kook. Now, watch this. We are going to learn a piece from Rav Kook. How do you define Torah Lishma? Your assignment is to tell us, is his definition of Torah Lishma more like Vilna, the approach of the Misnagdim, the Vilna Gaon, Nefesh HaChaim, or more like the mystical approach of mystical union with God of the Chassidim? So it's source number 7, for those of you who have the sources. It's really fantastic how he defines this notion. Let's read it. Inyan Torah Lishma. What is the concept of learning Torah for its own sake? L'shem HaTorah. It means for the sake of the Torah. Okay, now, I mentioned before that when you think about, from a grammatical point of view, the term, the Hebrew term, Torah Lishma. The word Lishma is l'shem, for the sake of, with a hey at the end of it, Lishma. For the sake of it. Now, the it that's being referred to, Torah Lishma, right? Torah for the sake of it, has to be a feminine it. This is just basic Hebrew grammar here, right? Lishma with a hey. If it would have been Torah for its sake, and it was a male it, then it would have been Torah Lishmo. Now, if we were to define Torah Lishma as learning Torah for the sake of God, then it should have been Torah Lishmo, learning Torah for his sake, assuming God is masculine, right? And indeed, one of the great Chassidic Rebbeim, the Maggid Mizrich, Rabbi Dober and Maggid Mizrich, who defines Torah Lishma in a very Chassidic fashion, that it's for the sake of dveikut, of mystical communion with God. He actually goes so far as to suggest that we find in the book of Yehoshua a verse, Lo yamu sefer Torah zemipicha v'higita bo yom v'layla, that the Torah should never leave your mouth, and you should meditate upon it day and night. And the Maggid, Rabbi Dober Mizrich, claims that, you notice it says, this book of the Torah shouldn't leave your mouth, and you should meditate upon it. The word for it in Hebrew is bo, the higita bo. You should meditate upon it day and night. He wants to claim that if it meant meditate upon the Torah, it should have said ba. That's feminine it. But it says bo, masculine it. So this book of the Torah should never leave your mouth, and you should meditate upon him. That's how Rabbi Dober Maggid Mizrich understood it. But that's totally not true grammatically, because the verse says that this Sefer Torah shouldn't leave your mouth, right? The book of the Torah. The subject is book, Sefer, that's masculine. In a similar fashion, when it says Torah Lishma, Torah for its sake, the it is feminine, not masculine. Torah for God's sake, it's Torah for its sake. What noun is the object of for its sake? It's the Torah. Torah Lishma. Torah, the word Torah is feminine. Lishma. Torah Lishma. Learning Torah for the Torah's sake. Okay, that's the first point the Rav Kook is making. It's a grammatical point. That Torah Lishma means L'Shem HaTorah, for the sake of the Torah. Now, when I do something for somebody else, I'm doing something for a friend, for his sake, I'm benefiting. I'm trying to do something for the benefit of somebody else. That's what it means do it for his sake. So Rav Kook wants to suggest Torah Lishma means I'm learning Torah for the sake of Torah, meaning for the benefit of Torah. For the benefit of Torah. Now, what could that possibly mean? I'm learning Torah for the benefit of Torah. Oh, there's this miskain, this thing called Torah. It needs help. So I'm going to learn Torah for the sake of Torah, for the benefit of Torah. What would that possibly mean? Put in your seatbelts and let's go on with Rav Kook. Ki mitziut hachochma hi ritzon Hashem yitbarach shetiya b'foal. The notion of chokhmah, of wisdom, Torah is a containing of wisdom. It's the desire of God that God's wisdom should be implemented and given expression concretely. That the divine wisdom not be some kind of abstraction, but it be given concrete expression. It's the most wonderful reality where we give expression to the divine will and wisdom, give concrete expression to it. Whenever we find in Torah something that somehow we can't extract from it, some kind of concrete and articulatable, I'm not sure that's a word, but a notion which can't be articulated, it's only because we're not understanding Torah properly. Understanding Torah properly means that we bring out from the Torah that wisdom which is hidden and in potential. We give it concrete expression and articulation. That's the goal. That's what God wants. Why is it that we don't always see the wisdom in the Torah and are not always able to articulate that wisdom? Because we're so material in our orientation that we're not always able to recognize the deeper meanings of the Torah. The chokhmat Torah harei hi hagilui eloki k'fi ratzano yitbarach haba mitzad avotenu v'talmudenu. V'nei kol lomei Torah hu motzi me'akoch lapol et mitziut hachokhmata mitzad nafsho. Now we get to the punchline. What is the wisdom of the Torah? What's the point of learning? The point of learning Torah is to bring from potential to actual the wisdom of the Torah. And then he adds an important point, that the light of Torah, which is revealed through novel insight as a result of my learning Torah, is different than the light which is revealed through somebody else learning Torah. Each one of us, when we learn Torah properly, is able to engage in a very important term, chidush, novel insight, new uncovering of meanings of Torah, which were up to this point only in potential, not in actual, because they weren't articulated. When each of us learns Torah, we are able to give further revelation of the meanings of the Torah through chidush, through being creative in our learning of Torah. And therefore, each of us who learns Torah is expanding the knowledge and articulation of all the different insights and wisdom of Torah, which before we learned it, were hidden only in potential. V'im kain hu magdila Torah mamash b'limudo. Therefore, when you learn Torah, what are you doing? You're magdil. You're making greater. You're expanding. When we learn Torah, we're expanding the Torah because its wisdom was concealed. Without learning Torah in a creative fashion, then it's a sealed book. What does it mean? What are its insights? When we engage in the learning of Torah in a creative fashion, we are revealing those insights, taking from the potential to the actual, the wisdom of the Torah. And therefore, we're expanding, magdil, the Torah. But kevan she'HaKadosh Baruch Hu says she'yagdil Torah, and since HaKadosh Baruch Hu desires that the Torah be expanded, that its wisdom go from potential to actual, that its hidden wisdom be articulated openly, haderech ha'ashar sheyilmad adam mitzad avato et or hagadol sherotzeh Hashem yikach b'lu mitziuta shitgadel yoter v'yoter. Therefore, our motive in learning Torah, our intent in learning Torah, is for the sake of Torah, to do it a favor, to bring its wisdom from a state of potential, of hiddenness, to actuality, to articulation. When we call it chadesh b'Torah, right, the notion of chidush, novel insight, to bring those beautiful ideas from potential to actual. Shehu vadai hagdalat Torah. That's what it means to expand the Torah. Mamash bor kaful, in this doubled light, using these mystical and lyrical expressions Rav Kook uses. Let's just summarize what he just said. It's an amazing idea. Torah Lishma grammatically means I'm learning Torah for its sake, the Torah's sake. To do it a favor, as it were. Because the Torah is saying, understand me, reveal my meaning, please, or else I'm a sealed book. So we learn Torah for its sake. We learn Torah in order to uncover new insight, to further develop its wisdom, to articulate those meanings which are latent in the Torah and are dependent upon us for bringing it from a state of hiddenness to a state of openness, of being revealed. Lagdil Torah ladira, to expand Torah and to beautify it. We learn Torah for its sake, to increase the understanding of Torah. Let's pause here for a second. Rav Kook, is he a Chassid or a Misnagid? I'd like to get some input from the Council of Torah sages here. The elders of Zion, what do you have to say? How does he fit in here?
I see him as a misnaged, because he's talking about Lagdil Torah. Limud Torah is number one. He's not talking about the Vekus, about some touchy-feely connecting to God or hugging a tree. He's talking about Limud Torah. That's Velazhin.
Yeah. Does anybody else? We'll get back to you in a second, Danny. Anybody else want to put in their 2 cents here? Who is Rav Kook? Is a Chassid or Misnagid? At least in this respect. Okay. Danny is 100% right, in my opinion. 100% right. There's no doubt about it. Here we see Rav Kook reflecting the Vilna Gaon, reflecting the approach of Volozhin, that Torah Lishma means to learn Torah in order to expand the understanding of Torah. Now, it's really interesting to compare and perhaps contrast Rav Kook with Nefesh HaChaim. Remember, Nefesh HaChaim quoted the Rosh. The Rosh said the purpose of understanding is to understand. The purpose of learning Torah, Lishma, right, for its sake, is to learn Torah to understand it. That sounded very dry and almost like self-evident. I'm learning Torah in order to understand it. What Rav Kook does here is he takes that idea, but he gives it theological depth. I'm sure it's, by the way, what Nefesh HaChaim meant, but didn't say it in my humble opinion, in as deep way as Rav Kook did. We're learning Torah to understand it, not because in the same sense that whenever I take a class or I study something, obviously I'm doing it to understand it. I mean, that's true. But what's the theological significance of it? The theological significance is that only through the learning of Torah, in order to give expression to its wisdom, through the unique perspective that each of us brings to learning of Torah, only through that is there expansion of Torah, lahagdil Torah, to expand the meaning of Torah, which is God's intent and desire. So Rav Kook here is firmly in the non-Chassidic camp in this particular case. And more than that, just to reiterate what I just said, I think he gives an analysis of the non-Chassidic approach on a level which I think the Nefesh HaChaim perhaps stopped and left it perhaps on a little bit of a superficial level. To say we're learning Torah to understand that really is not giving proper appreciation to what that actually means. Though I'm sure Nefesh HaChaim actually meant what Rav Kook said, but Rav Kook says it very well. Okay. I want to go on a little bit. Just want to point out how we sometimes overly academize, I just made up a new English word, the approach of the Vilna Gaon. As I said in the beginning, he's not a Harvard professor. Learning Torah is a deeply spiritual experience. I gave the example that the Baal Tanya said you should stop every hour so you can sort of recenter yourself in terms of your intent of this mystical communion with God. I want to show you something now amazing. The Nefesh HaChaim was written after Tanya. And in many ways, it's considered to be a non-Chassidic response to Tanya. Look on source number 8 here. We're returning to the Nefesh HaChaim. And he says in the second paragraph here, I'll just read it. I have a translation here. And the Nefesh HaChaim says, and in the same way, in the middle of learning, a person is permitted to stop for a short time before his awe of God that he accepted upon him before starting learning is extinguished from his heart and mind, and to contemplate anew a bit more awe of God. So, this is amazing. The Baal Tanya had said, stop your learning every hour in order to recenter your intent, which is I'm learning in order to mystical union with God. Amazingly enough, Nefesh HaChaim says the exact same thing, that in the middle of learning that one is permitted to stop to make sure that the awe of God, which is the prerequisite of learning Torah, can be renewed and replenished, because you may become so engrossed in the sugya, in the rational analysis of the Talmudic idea, that you forget what you're doing. You're learning the word of God, which has to be done in a state of awe and trepidation. And therefore, you should take these regular breaks throughout your learning in order to replenish that spiritual intent. That's pretty amazing. I have a feeling that the Nefesh HaChaim had in mind the Tanya. But you notice that there is a slight difference between the two. Whereas in the words of Tanya, we're taking a break in order to recenter ourselves with regards to the intent of mystical union with God. The Nefesh HaChaim is saying we're taking breaks in order to reestablish the posture of fear of God. No reference to mystical unity with God. So there's a a kind of similarity of technique, but preserving the difference in how we define Torah Lishma. Okay. I want to conclude our discussion of this topic with a really nice addition to this notion of how do we define Torah Lishma. Very last source. This is from one of the Rebbes of Chabad, or Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the most recent Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he says a beautiful idea. It's very typical of the way the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe would speak. Source number 10. Mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. We know that even though we're supposed to be learning Torah Lishma, learning Torah for its sake, the famous passage in the Talmud says that even though that may not be your intent, do it anyway. This regards to all mitzvahs. Mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. That you'll start out by doing it for the wrong reason, but there's something in the mitzvah itself, especially in learning Torah, that will bring you through a process of maturation, spiritual growth, that you'll come to do Torah for the right reason, lishma, for its sake. So now he says a beautiful thing. He says, "Haperush bazehu." What does that phrase mean? That mitoch shelo lishma, from doing it not for its sake, you'll come to do it for its sake. It means the following: Lo rak shelachar zman adam yagil lishma. It doesn't just mean that chronologically you'll mature, you'll ripen, you'll develop from a state of lo lishma, not for its sake, to a state of lishma. It doesn't just mean that. But the words that the Talmud uses to express this idea, mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma, that phrase mitoch literally means from inside. Toch means inside, mitoch. From inside the lo lishma is the lishma. From inside the lo lishma is the lishma. Now, he's going to explain it. Aval kvar achshav batoch shelo. Even now, not talking about a chronological process of ripening and maturation and development from an improper intention to a proper intention, but mitoch, inside, that even in the inside of the person who is learning Torah not for the proper reason, kvar kayem et hakavana lishma. There's already buried deep within that person, mitoch, inside of it, is a deeper intention which he's not aware of, which is the lishma. So it's not just a question of chronological development, but mitoch, but from inside of it right now, in the deeper, wrong intent is the right intent. Hatoch shelo lishma hu lishma. The inner essence of the not for its own sake contains the for its sake. Betoch shel kol Yehudi, inside the inner nature, essential aspect of every Jew, be'ezeh matzav sherak yeh, no matter who that person is, nimtza meratzon v'kavana l'kayem et rasono shel Kadosh Baruch Hu. There is in that person the desire and the intent to fulfill the will of the Holy and Blessed be He. This is just a beautiful Chassidic notion that in the pnimiyut, in the very internal essence of every Jew, is this godly soul which wants to do everything in accordance with the will of God and for the right reason. And that's why the formulation is mitoch shelo lishma, that from the inner aspect of the wrong reason is already the lishma. Not just that there'll be a process of maturation, but it's there right now. So with that very optimistic and very attractive and very affirmative understanding of this notion, we can appreciate why people move from Volozhin to Chabad, right? Because there is something very thus positive and optimistic about the Chassidic approach, which is very attractive. But I hope our analysis here gave us some insight into this fundamental parting of the ways, and to use Professor Etkes's approach, and thanks to Danny for this, that the emphasis on the spiritual experience on the one hand versus adherence in a God-fearing manner to the divine will. And that perhaps is, at bottom line, the parting of the ways between the Mignagdic world and the Hasidic world, ecstatic spiritual experience versus service of God, self-transcendence, adherence to his will. And with that, I turn it over to Rav Chaim. Take care, everybody.